and welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today, we're traveling back to the Old West to learn about Young Guns 2. Now, if you haven't already, you can find an episode about the first Young Guns movie. That's episode number 146 of Based on a True Story. Hop in the show notes to find that link. But maybe it's been a while since you've seen Young Guns 2. So let's start with our movie synopsis. At the start of the movie, we're in the early 1950s, when an attorney meets with an older man by the name of Brushy Bill Roberts, who claims he is the real Billy the Kid. Then, to prove his case, he tells the lawyer the plot line of the movie. And that takes us back to the late 1870s, when Billy the Kid is on the run from the law after the events of the Lincoln County War in the first Young Guns movie, along with many of the same characters in his gang, such as Doc Skurlock, Arkansas Dave Rudabaugh, Chavez E. Chavez, and Pat Garrett. Billy agrees to meet with the governor of New Mexico to get a pardon in exchange for testifying against the Dolan Murphy faction from the first movie. And then, after he allows himself to get arrested to do that testimony, that promise turns out to be false. So, without a pardon on the table, Billy escapes capture, rescues some of his gang members, and gets out of town before it's too late. Now, they're trying to go from New Mexico to Old Mexico, but Pat Garrett decides he wants to settle down. So he's paid a lot of money to become the sheriff and hunt down his former friend, Billy the Kid. Ultimately, Billy is caught and sentenced to be hanged, but he escapes capture yet again. Finally, as the movie comes to a close, Sheriff Garrett catches up with Billy one-on-one and maybe kills him. The movie cuts back to the elderly man from the beginning of the movie who implies the death of Billy the Kid was faked and he lived on as Brushy Bill Roberts. What is fact? What is fiction? Today, we'll be joined by Josh from the extremely popular Wild West Extravaganza podcast over at wildwestextra.com. But before we chat with Josh, we need to set up our little game for this episode. Now, if you're new to the show, since Based on a True Story is all about separating the fact from the fiction in the movies, you'll get to practice your skills at separating fact from fiction in this podcast episode with the little game of two truths and a lie. So I'm about to give you three things that we're going to talk about throughout this episode. Two of those are true, and that means one of those is just an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number one, Billy the Kid's safe place was Fort Sumner. Number two, Pat Garrett never rode with Billy the Kid's outlaw gang. Number three, Garrett and Billy robbed a train together in 1879. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, see if you can figure out which one of those is the lie. And if you're watching the video version of this, you can see I'm holding up the envelope that has the answer inside. So we'll open this at the end of the episode and see if you got it right. All right. Now it's time to connect with Josh about the historical accuracy of Young Guns 2. Before we talk about some of the details in the movie, let's take a step back and look at the movie overall. So if you were to give Young Guns 2 a letter grade for its historical accuracy, what would it get?
I think I'd probably go with C+. It's not the most historically accurate movie ever made. It is probably more accurate than a lot of the other Billy the Kid movies. And I think they really captured the essence of Billy the Kid, his personality, just kind of the way he was, just his mischievousness, I guess. So for that alone, I'm going to give it a C+.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty good, especially being a sequel as well. Sometimes will throw, because they're kind of tied to the inaccuracies of the first movie, and then tying in. I've had that be an issue before too. So C+ is not bad, actually.
And it's one of the better sequels that have ever been made. You know, a lot of times the sequels are pretty lackluster, but Young Guns 2 definitely lived up to the legacy of Young Guns 1. So, and I grew up with these movies, man. I used to play Young Guns at recess in elementary school. So I was all about Young Guns.
Yeah. Nice. I'm sure that's helped influence what you're doing now.
Oh, yeah, man. There's a few works of basically art, I guess, that definitely, if it wasn't for the book Lonesome Dove, and if it wasn't for Young Guns 1 and 2, I probably would not be doing this podcast. It really instilled in me, just a love of history in general, Old West history. And with Young Guns, Billy the Kid, man, he's just the guy I keep going back to. Out of everybody I cover on my show, all of the mountain men and gunfighters and outlaws, Billy the Kid is just the guy I keep coming back to.
Well, if we go back to the movie at the very beginning of Young Guns 2, we're introduced to an older man going by the name of Brushy Bill Roberts. And he claims to be Billy the Kid, and he's proving his claims by telling the story to a lawyer. And that story is basically the plot of the entire movie. So we'll be talking about that throughout our discussion today. And then, of course, we'll circle back to Brushy Bill himself when we see him at the end of the movie. But one of the most common things for movies to do is to just make up characters. So for those of us who have only seen the movie, is it true that there was someone named Brushy Bill who claimed to be Billy the Kid?
Yes, that is absolutely true. Brushy Bill Roberts, his real name was Oliver Roberts, but he did come forward in the 1940s claiming to be Billy the Kid, and he wanted that pardon, just like he says in the movie at the beginning. The main difference, I would say, the movie, it looks like they filmed it at White Sands, New Mexico. I'm not entirely sure about that, but that's what it looks like to me. That's not how the meeting went down. It actually occurred at Brushy's house in Hico, Texas.
Okay.
But other than
it
that,
was kind of a weird location just in the middle of the desert on the side of the road.
I guess they were kind of going for the effect of, he was still a wanted outlaw, just a desperado living in the desert. But no, at that point in time, Brushy Bill Roberts was definitely living in just a normal Texas town.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. We'll circle back to him, but if we go back to the 1800s storyline in the movie, we get introduced to some other characters as the members of Billy the Kid's gang. So I'll list off the four, who I consider the four main characters. Feel free to add more if you'd like, but there's Doc Scurlock, he's played by Kiefer Sutherland. Arkansas Dave Rudabaugh, who's played by Christian Slater. Chavez E. Chavez, played by Lou Diamond Phillips. And then someone that is pretty popular, Pat Garrett, another one of those popular ones. He's played by William Peterson. Were those characters based on real people who rode with Billy the Kid?
Yes, with a couple of asterisks. So Pat Garrett never actually rode with Billy the Kid as far as outlaw activities or anything like that. They really kind of strayed from the truth in that aspect in the movie. Pat Garrett and Billy were friends. Pat was a buffalo hunter in Texas. He moved to New Mexico. I'm not exactly sure of the exact year. And he settled down at Fort Sumner, New Mexico. And he just ran different businesses. He had he was a bartender for a little while. He had like a butcher shop for a while. And he and Billy would hang out whenever they were together. They would gamble together. They would dance with the senoritas, all that stuff. We can kind of circle back to how close their friendship was later on. But yeah, Pat Garrett absolutely was a real person. He was involved in Billy the Kid's life, but there's really not much evidence that he participated in outlaw activities. Now, everybody stole horses back in those days. Everybody stole a few cows every now and then. Even the most respectable of people, had some stolen livestock in their past. There are allegations that Garrett was selling stolen livestock out of his butcher shop. He himself may have gone and rounded up a few head here and there. I wouldn't doubt it. But as far as him going out and, killing bounty hunters with Billy the Kid or just basically doing any illegal activities with Billy other than maybe possibly buying and selling stolen livestock, there's really no indication. As far as the others, Doc Scurlock and Jose Chavez E. Chavez, those are both real life people. They were more involved in Billy's life. If anybody's ever seen Young Guns Part 1, where they basically cover the Lincoln County War, that's when Scurlock and Chavez were riding with Billy the Kid. They were Lincoln County regulators. After the Lincoln County War, they kind of drifted apart. Chavez stayed down in Lincoln County for a while. He would end up going to prison later on. Doc Scurlock, he would settle up at Fort Sumner, so he and Billy still remain close, but Doc started distancing himself. By the time the events unfold that we see in Young Guns 2, Doc Scurlock was already living in Texas. He left the whole thing behind. He got married. He settled down, became an honest man. Dave Rudabaugh, also very real person. He was never known as Arkansas Dave, though, historically. I'm not really sure where that nickname comes from. There are stories that I've been unable to corroborate that he may have stolen cattle in Arkansas years prior. I actually reached out to John Fusco. This was a few months ago. John Fusco is the guy who wrote and directed Young Guns 1 and 2. He's done a lot of great movies. And I thought maybe he had a source on that I wasn't familiar with. So I reached out. It's like, hey, man, where did you find this information about him being called Arkansas Dave? Is that something you just made up? According to him, he could be completely pulling my chain, but he says he just made it up. He said it had a better ring to it than Dirty Dave Rudaball is what he was actually known as, believe it or not. So I guess Arkansas Dave sounds cooler than Dirty Dave. But and even that Dirty Dave nickname, I may be mistaken here, but I believe it only comes from one source. At one point, Dave was arrested and taken to Las Vegas, New Mexico. And there was a journalist there, a local paper published an article saying that he was wearing the same clothes that he had been wearing the last time he was in Vegas. So I guess that's where the dirty thing comes from. Whether or not he was unhygienic, I honestly don't have any idea. But yeah, he was the real deal. He was really more of an accomplished outlaw than any of these guys. He was a few years older than Billy the Kid. He had been caught robbing a train in Kansas. He spent time, like I said, in Las Vegas, New Mexico, sort of as a crooked lawman. And he eventually participated in the killing of a jailer. So by the time him and Billy link up, Dave was wanted for murder. But yeah, all these guys were real. The other two members of the gang that you see in Young Guns 2, you got Tom Folliard or O'Folliard, depending on which version of his last name you want to go with. He too was a real life person. He wasn't a 14-year-old kid like they show in the movie, but he was real. He was a member of Billy's gang. The other guy you see, Hendry French, he's sort of a composite character. There was a real guy named Henry Newton French that Billy rode with. Yeah, I guess they just kind of made like a composite character out of a few different people. But in all reality, in the events that we see in Young Guns 2, Billy the Kid's main core group was Dave Rudaball, Tom Folliard, and two other guys named Billy Wilson and Tom Pickett. Those seem to be his main outlaw buddies at that time.
Maybe it's just me, but when you have a nickname like Arkansas Dave, I assume that either he's from Arkansas or he made a name in Arkansas before joining Billy the Kid. And I guess throughout the movie, he's also kind of he's trying to be the one that everybody knows who he is. So I was just assuming that he made a name for himself in Arkansas somewhere as a outlaw beforehand or something.
Oh, and Dave got around, man. Dave knew. He rubbed shoulders with a lot of famous people from the Old West, like Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson and Doc Holliday. He knew all those guys. So, I've heard people say that Rudaball was the only man that Billy the Kid feared. I don't know if that's true, but like I said a minute ago, he was a few years older than Billy. So I'm not sure how much of it was just him just straight up taking orders from a 19-year-old. Rather than them just working together. You know what I mean? But yeah, he's a really interesting guy. If anybody's interested in learning more about him, I do have a full episode just on Dave Rudaball.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I'll make sure to add a link to that in the show notes so people can check that out. If we go back to the movie, New Mexico Governor Lew Wallace convinces Billy the Kid to testify against the Murphy Dolan faction who murdered John Tunstall in exchange for a pardon. That was kind of the context of the first movie. But then, so Billy the Kid in this one, Young Guns 2, Billy the Kid agrees and allows Wallace to arrest him so Wallace can protect Billy from anyone who wants to kill him before he can testify. But then Billy's double-crossed when the prosecuting attorney sides with the Irish politicians running Lincoln County. Instead of going along with the pardon, he intends on taking Billy to trial where he will surely be hanged. And while the movie doesn't really mention it here, the impression that I got was this is the pardon that the older Brushy Bill mentioned wanting at the beginning of the movie. Is there any truth to the movie's storyline around the pardon for Billy the Kid being offered?
Yes, that's also based on a true story. Billy was offered a pardon from then Governor Lew Wallace. A little bit different what they show in the movie. Billy actually reached out to him as opposed to Wallace reaching out to Billy the Kid. And at that time, mostly due to the Lincoln County War, that area was in complete disarray. Like, matter of fact, whenever Lew Wallace was made governor, right around the same time, then President, I believe it was Rutherford B. Hayes. He, gosh, what do they call it when he martial law? What did he something martial law? Anyway, he gosh, I'm blanking on the word. He imposed martial law on Lincoln County. I mean, there was a lot of outlaw activities going on at that time, a lot of lawlessness, but also at the same time, Governor Lew Wallace sort of issued a blanket amnesty for people on both sides, as long as they didn't have any active indictments against them, which that didn't apply to Billy. He was wanted for murder. So were several of his close friends. So I guess he wanted in on a little bit of that amnesty action. So that's why he reached out to the governor. They did meet in Lincoln, like they show in the movie. They met in secrecy. They sort of hammered out the details. And yeah, Billy left that meeting convinced that he was going to receive a pardon, and he agreed to testify.
I mean, I guess that's why they call it the Wild West, right? I mean, just,
Right.
everybody's got some sort of crime that they've done, like you were talking about before. So I don't know what was just the general public opinion of these pardons being offered. Like, because Billy the Kid at that point, was he like a well-known outlaw that then offering a pardon to him would have affected? I'm just trying to think of, politicians today offering a pardon and the public reaction to who they offer the pardon to. Was that kind of a thing back then too? Or am I projecting today's politics back then?
I'm not sure how that applied to at the time frame when Billy and Governor Wallace agreed on the pardon. I'm not really sure what the public sentiment was. Billy was nowhere near as famous in his lifetime as he is nowadays. I mean, a lot of these famous figures from the Old West, their fame comes from best-selling novels and movies that followed the books later on. He was notorious. He was well known in that area of New Mexico, certainly. And as his fame grew, he would be reported on papers as far away as New York City or even Paris, France. But he wasn't necessarily a household name. I can tell you that, spoiler alert, when he was killed later on, there were so many grateful people that the guy that killed him ended up receiving several $1,000s just in donations, just from people that were glad to be rid of Billy the Kid. So as far as the public sentiment, I'm not entirely sure that the public was aware that he was being offered a pardon. That's another thing. There's not really anything written down in black and white saying Lew Wallace absolutely guaranteed Billy the Kid a pardon. It was more of an agreement. There's some people that think maybe that Billy read more into Wallace's words than he should have. Maybe he put a little bit too much faith into Wallace. But as far as I'm aware, this was not a known thing that was just reported on in the newspapers.
Okay. More of an under the table type.
Right. And, when they arrested Billy, they had to stage an arrest. So he didn't just, walk in one day and say, hey, arrest me. They had to stage an arrest to make it look legit.
Yeah, the movie kind of alludes to that. I don't remember actually seeing it happen in the movie, but it alludes to, we got to stage this to put on the appearance that we've actually caught you. Yeah.
Right. Yep.
Well, after he realizes he's not going to get the pardon, Billy slips out of his handcuffs thanks to, as the movie puts it, a historical and biological fact that he had small hands and big wrists. Then he proceeds to escape and comes back pretending to be part of a lynch mob. They have faces covered. Law enforcement just hands over Doc and Chavez, assuming that they're going to get killed by this lynch mob. But then, of course, the real vigilantes show up, and there's a huge shootout before Billy and his gang can escape. Did this escape from the Lincoln County courthouse really happen the way that we see it in the movie?
Absolutely not. It was nothing like that. Billy was not in chains. He was not locked behind bars. He was basically under voluntary house arrest. during that period. So there are kernels of truth in there. They show everybody being thrown into like a pit in the ground. That was a real thing. There was a pit jail in Lincoln, New Mexico. And matter of fact, Billy had been thrown in that pit back at the very beginning of the Lincoln County War. So he had actually spent time in there. I'm not exactly sure about this, but by the time he comes back to Lincoln, I think they may have had an actual jail at that point. But no, there was no gunfight with a lynch mob, nothing like that. Billy stuck around, and they gloss over a few things. Billy did testify in real life. He testified in quite a few trials against a lot of his old enemies, and he spent, man, I want to say 2 to 3 months there in Lincoln, basically under voluntary house arrest. And once he figured out that pardon wasn't coming, he just got on a horse and rode out. That was it. No gunfight, no dramatics, nothing like that.
Oh, okay. Well, that wouldn't be as fun in the movie.
Oh, yeah, I know. One thing you touched on was the big wrist and tiny hands. I've always struggled with this because I've never seen anybody with wrists bigger than their hands. You know what I mean? But it is an undeniable fact that Billy was able to slip out of his chains on multiple occasions. He was able to slide out of them. So he may have had abnormally tiny hands. I really don't know, but that is a true fact. In this instance, though, he was not shackled or in chains or anything like that.
I touch on it briefly too, but the movie does make a point to say that there's one thing an outlaw feared in New Mexico territory, and that's lynch mob justice. And that, to me, as I was watching the movie, it implied that they didn't necessarily fear law enforcement, though. So is it true that outlaws in the Old West feared vigilantes wanting to lynch them rather than actual law enforcement?
Yeah, they feared both. So vigilante justice was a very real problem in the Old West, particularly in places like around that area, Lincoln, New Mexico. And part of it came from the law enforcement officials themselves being just as corrupt as the outlaws. So a lot of times they would just arrest their enemies as opposed to the people that were really committing the crimes. So on one hand, you had sheriffs and town marshals that weren't doing anything about the crime. So the only recourse for justice in a lot of situations were these lynch mobs. And at the same time, if you were arrested, I've covered a lot of these guys, man. So many times I can tell you there would be just a stone cold killer like John Wesley Hardin or Kingfisher or Clay Allison, and they would gun somebody down in cold blood. They would make it to trial and they would get off. They would just get off with a plea of self-defense or something like that. 9 times out of 10, if you made it to trial without being lynched by the vigilantes, you would just get off scot-free. So that was another reason why the vigilantes were so prevalent. They knew if this guy actually goes before a judge, he's just going to get a slap on the wrist at most. So if we want justice to be served, we're going to have to do it ourselves. Unfortunately, that meant a lot of innocent people also got lynched. No due process, no jury of your peers or anything like that. So it was not a good situation. Billy would have definitely been afraid of mob justice. He knew all about mob justice. In fact, I mentioned a moment ago, they had a staged arrest. He was very particular in who he was going to allow to arrest him. And he was basically worried that if the wrong people arrested him, air quotes, then he would get shot in the back while, once again, attempting to escape, And him and his buddies, they did the same thing during the Lincoln County War. They murdered a couple of guys who they claimed later on were attempting to escape. More than likely, it was just an execution. He knew the same thing happening to him would be a very real possibility. But if it was like a legitimate sheriff that arrested him that was half-ass honest, he would have been all right. He just didn't want any of his enemies, who a lot of his enemies also wore badges, because they would have killed him in a heartbeat. No doubt about it.
Yeah, it sounds like the justice system wasn't really great back then in serving justice.
Well, I've thought about that before. I want to, it almost seems like they erred on the side of justice almost. Like, okay, we're not going to convict this person unless we know without a shadow of a doubt that they're guilty, right? So a lot of times I think people think of Old West justice like it was very harsh. You get caught stealing a horse and you're going to be executed. Nah, they would just either send him to jail for a little bit or let him go. If a lynch mob didn't get him, they were just fine.
So then is it maybe that there just wasn't proof? I mean, everybody didn't have phones and be able to take pictures and video and stuff like that. So it's pretty much, it sounds like it'd be a lot of he said, she said type evidence. And so if it's really hard to prove, then they could get away with it.
Yeah, I mean, if you get in a gunfight with somebody in the saloon and enough of your buddies are willing to say that the other person drew first, you're fine. You're going to get by with it. And that's what I've seen happen time and time again with a lot of these guys. They just had really good lawyers and some pretty good friends to testify on their behalf.
Well, if you go back to the movie, after escaping, Billy and his gang plan to go to Old Mexico, but they need some money first. So they go to the richest man in New Mexico territory, John Chisholm. And the movie sets it up that John Chisholm was the financial partner for Tunstall and McSween, which makes him a friend of Billy the Kid. But once Billy gets there, he demands $500 and Chisholm refuses to pay. So instead, Billy kills a couple of Chisholm's men. And that basically turns Chisholm into an enemy. So then Chisholm decides to use his money to finance the hunting of Billy the Kid. Was that really how Billy the Kid turned John Chisholm against him?
Yes and no. He didn't kill his men like they show in the movie. He did try to basically extort money from Chisholm. That much is true. Chisholm refused to pay, at which point Billy started stealing cattle from him. Now, was Billy already stealing cattle from him? Probably. Would he have stolen cattle even if Chisholm had paid him the money? Probably. Billy was a thief, man. He stole horses and he stole cattle. That's what he did. You know, Billy the Kid never robbed a train. He never held up a stagecoach. He never robbed a bank. Nothing like that. He was just a cattle thief and a horse thief. A lot of people at that time were stealing Mr. Chisholm's cattle. A lot of people. Billy got the brunt of the blame, though. He was the more well-known of the people that were out there robbing with both hands. And there were even certain killings that he was not involved in that he was blamed for. And that kind of leads back into what we were talking about earlier as far as his notoriety goes. As his fame grew, he just got blamed for pretty much everything that occurred in New Mexico territory at that time. But yeah, as soon as he started stealing cattle from Chisholm, that's when Chisholm and there was actually another guy named, well, we'll get to him in a minute, named Joseph Leah. And they were both, let me correct that. I'm not entirely sure I'm saying his last name correctly, Joseph Lee or Joseph Leah. But they were both really fed up with Billy the Kid just stealing from everybody. And but yeah, it was primarily the stealing of Chisholm's livestock that turned him against Billy the Kid. Now, there is another story. It's a little bit apocryphal. Supposedly, John Chisholm showed up at Fort Sumner one day in the saloon there in the cantina, and Billy held him at pistol at gunpoint and basically demanded, I want $500 right now. Chisholm said, hey, I don't have my checkbook on me. I don't have any money on me. Let me go back to my ranch and I'll send you a check in the mail, basically. Billy ended up letting him go. Now, whether or not that actually happened, I don't know. Doesn't sound like something that Chisholm would agree to. I think Chisholm would have probably told him to go to hell. But the source on that is a guy named Paco Aneo who did know Billy the Kid, but you know, sometimes Paco liked to stretch the truth a little bit. But yeah, as far as the animosity between Billy and Chisholm, that was absolutely true.
Were they ever allies then? Because when they ride in the movie, when they ride up to Chisholm's ranch, it gives the impression that in the events of the first movie, the first Young Guns, that Chisholm was an ally of Tunstall and McSweeney. So perhaps he and Billy were friends at one point. That's the impression I got from the movie, at least.
They probably weren't friends just because at that time frame when the Lincoln County War was going on, Billy would have been 17 or 18. Chisholm was, you know, a middle-aged man by that point. He probably didn't even know about Billy the Kid during the Lincoln County War, but he would have certainly known about him at this point. And yeah, Chisholm was somewhat aligned with Billy's former boss, Tunstall, and Tunstall's partner, Alexander McSween. Chisholm really didn't take part in that conflict, though. but it was sort of, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, basically. Chisholm was kind of opposed to the same people that Tunstall and McSween were opposed to. But as far as Billy's claims that Chisholm owed him money, I think he like I said, he was basically just trying to extort some money from him, which he would have stolen from him anyway. I am 100% positive of that.
I mean, it sounds like, yeah, stealing cattle was a thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And Chisholm stole cattle. Everybody back in those days was a livestock thief. Chisholm used to send his men over to the Mescalero Apache reservation and steal their livestock because he knew they couldn't do anything about it. So he's not exactly, the purest of souls either.
Wow. Okay. I guess do unto others as you would have done unto you. And it's happening.
Yeah.
It's happening.
It's happening.
Well, you might have already answered this some, but if we go back to the movie's versions of events, at this point, John Chisholm decides to hire a thief to catch a thief. So then throughout the movie, we get Pat Garrett going from being friend and riding with Billy the Kid to wanting to settle down. And Chisholm hears about this and offers Garrett the chance to settle down by making him Sheriff Pat Garrett, giving him $500 cash up front, the men and resources to hunt down Billy the Kid, and then a guarantee of $500 cash once Garrett kills Billy. And if we're to believe the movie's version of events, Garrett accepts the job offer and the hunt for Billy the Kid begins. Does the movie accurately portray this swing in Garrett's character arc, going from being Billy's friend to then being hired by Chisholm as the sheriff to kill him?
Well, there's several different caveats there. Chisholm had no authority to make anybody a sheriff. So really all he did was convince Pat Garrett to run for sheriff. He still had to be elected and all that stuff. He still had to go out on the campaign trail, Now, what happened, Garrett got married, I want to say it was in January of 1880. Not long thereafter, he moved to Roswell, New Mexico, which at that point was part of Lincoln County. Back in those days, Lincoln County was massive. It was way bigger than it is nowadays. So Roswell, New Mexico was still Lincoln County. While he was there in Lincoln, he gets buddy with John Chisholm and the guy I mentioned earlier, Joseph Lea, and they basically convince him to run for sheriff. I don't know where they got the $500 up front and $500 after. I don't believe that either one of those guys paid Garrett anything to run. Garrett wanted to become a respectable man. That was a big goal of his. He had spent a lot of time at Fort Sumner, sort of cavorting with people that maybe had a little bit of loose morals. He was a married man now. He was going to raise a family. He wanted to make a name for himself. And they convinced him to run for sheriff. I don't think there was any money exchanged. Later on, Billy would have a $500 bounty placed on his head. Maybe that's where they're basing it from. But that bounty was never from Chisholm or Joseph Lea. That was actually offered by Lew Wallace, the governor.
In the movie, the impression I got was that Chisholm convinced Garrett to be sheriff specifically to hunt for Billy the Kid. Was that basically the reason why he became sheriff then, to hunt for Billy? Or was it more that he became sheriff and then, well, now there's this outlaw and that's your job?
No, yeah, that was his you are right about that. That was his primary reason for running for sheriff. That's why they wanted him to run for sheriff. And, part of it, like you say, it takes a thief to catch a thief. While there's not necessarily any indication that Garrett and Billy had rode the Hoot Owl Trail together or anything like that, he was still very familiar with Billy's mannerisms, with Billy's various hideouts, with his habits. So he was intimately aware of Billy the Kid. Now, as far as their friendship is concerned, this is something that historians still debate about all the time. There's some people that try to downplay it and say they were just acquaintances, There's other people that go with basically the same route they went in the movie, that they were just the best of friends, almost like brothers. I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. If Paulita Maxwell, she was one of Billy the Kid's gal pals, if what she said is any indication, they were extremely tight. They were very good friends, but that friendship doesn't really seem to have extended outside of Fort Sumner. Now, Paulita would later, decades later, she would say that when they found out that Garrett was running for sheriff, it came as a big shock to him. Like, they didn't think he would turn on his friends like that. And that basically severed their friendship. From that point on, if they came face to face, there was probably going to be some violence.
Okay, so it wasn't like Garrett ran with Billy the Kid, though, like we see happening in the beginning of the movie.
If anybody can find any historical evidence showing as much, I'm all eyes and ears, but I have never been able to find any indication that they did outlaw activities together. Now, when Garrett won matter of fact, Billy actually campaigned against him during the election. He would travel out. Yeah, he would travel out to like the local Hispanic communities and tell them, hey, don't vote for this joker. Wasn't enough. Garrett had the backing, not just of Chisholm and Leia, but he had his cronies up in Santa Fe, the Santa Fe ring. They were backing his play. Now, interestingly enough, it was just like nowadays, you can win an election, but you're still not going to take hold of that office until the following year, right? So if you're elected in November, you're not going to take office until January, February. It was the same thing with Pat Garrett. However, the guy who was the sheriff, the incumbent, the guy that he beat in the election, he basically went ahead and deputized Garrett and then stepped back. So for all intents and purposes, Garrett was sheriff. He was basically sheriff at that point. As soon as he won the election, he may not have been sheriff in name, but he was a deputy with the power of the Lincoln County Sheriff. He also received a commission as a deputy U.S. Marshal. Because Fort Sumner, where Billy the Kid liked to spend time, that was not in Lincoln County. So even as sheriff, he would not have jurisdiction up there. But with that marshal's badge, now you can go anywhere.
Oh, so maybe that's kind of in the movie because they hand him the badge right away. So maybe that was kind of a nod to that of pretty much becoming a sheriff right away. It sounds like, even if it's not official by title, but.
Mm-hmm. And he did. I mean, as soon as he got that badge, he went on the hunt. That was his primary goal. Not necessarily to kill, but to arrest Billy the Kid.
In the movie, after he becomes sheriff, we see Pat Garrett hiring a journalist to tag along and record the hunt for Billy the Kid so then he can turn it into a book. And then at the end of the movie, there's some text on screen saying that the book was called The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, and it was a failure, according to the movie. Did he really write that book, and was it a failure, or was it any good?
Yeah, it was a failure at the time. But yeah, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid was published, I believe it was in 1882. So very, very soon after the events that are portrayed in the movie. And the guy that you see there, Ash Upson, he was hired by Pat Garrett basically to be a ghostwriter. So as far as I have a love-hate relationship with that book. You can tell the parts that Ash Upson wrote, and you can tell the parts that Pat Garrett wrote. Ash Upson, he was a little full of it. He never let the truth get in the way of a good story, right? Ash Upson even went so far, he didn't know Billy the Kid's actual birth date, so he just substituted it with his own birth date. Like, stuff like that, He would just make stuff up. You can kind of sort of tell where Ash Upson stops writing and Pat Garrett takes over. Because the parts where Pat's talking about, especially towards the end of the book, there's a lot more accuracy there. So it's one of those sources that you got to take with a grain of salt. You definitely need to corroborate a lot of the stuff in the book with other sources. But to me, it's a must read for anybody who's a fan of Billy the Kid history.
Yeah. It sounds like well, I guess like movies, they never get the truth get in the way of a good story. It just sounds like that's the case too there. Well, in the movie, while they're on the run, Billy and his gang end up in the town of White Oaks at a brothel run by Jane Greathouse. And she's played by Jenny Wright in the movie, and she seems to be an old friend of Billy's. And then that night, a mob of townspeople carrying torches threaten to burn the building down if Billy and his gang don't give themselves up. A local lawman, a guy named Deputy Carlisle, goes inside, tries to talk to Billy, tries to get him to come out peacefully. But instead, Billy tricks Carlisle into putting on Chavez's hat and coat and then pushes Carlisle out of the front door. And the mob is waiting there. They just open fire and kill him, thinking that it's Chavez. But of course, it's not. And then when they realize their mistake, the town scatters. And that's how Billy gets out of that one, even though the older, brushy Bill says that he got pinned with Carlisle's death. How much of that event really happened?
Some of it.
Never let the truth get in the way.
Never let the truth. And I used to love that scene when I was a kid. I had the biggest crush on Ginny Wright at that time. But yeah, she never existed in real life. Jane Greathouse was actually Jim Greathouse. It was a man. They called him Whiskey Jim because he used to legally sell alcohol to Native Americans. He ran a roadhouse. It wasn't actually in White Oaks. It was about 40 miles to the north. And it wasn't necessarily a house of ill repute. It was basically a place where you could go and get a meal, a couple of drinks, and a place to sleep for the night. Whether or not he had any soiled doves working for him, that I can't say. I'm sure he did, but I honestly don't know about that. But it was sort of a hangout for Billy and several of his buddies. There's a lot of people that think that that's where Billy first met Dave Rudaball. Now, on the day in question, it was Billy the Kid, Dave Rudaball, and Billy Wilson. So Chavez and Skurlock and the others that you see in the movie, they were not there for this. But yeah, they were surrounded by a posse. Deputy Carlisle, he wasn't like a full-time deputy. He was a blacksmith, believe it or not. He was just deputized to be part of this posse. And the reason he went inside is because he knew some of those guys. He was on friendly terms with them. So they sort of swapped it out. So Jim Greathouse, he goes outside and he's basically the posse's hostage while Deputy Carlisle is inside trying to talk everybody into surrendering. Well, Billy's not going to surrender to a lynch mob. So he's steadily pouring whiskey down Deputy Carlisle's mouth, gets him stumbling drunk. The posse outside keeps tossing out ultimatums. And finally they say, we're going to give you 5 minutes. If you don't come out and surrender, we're going to kill Jim Greathouse. There's a shot that gets fired. Supposedly, Billy the Kid would later claim, a shot was fired from the outside, at which point drunken Carlisle freaks out, jumps through the window. Okay? As soon as he jumps through the window, he's gunned down by his posse. That's according to Billy the Kid. Later on, Dave Rudaball allegedly told somebody that he, Billy Wilson, and Billy the Kid, that all three of them shot Carlisle in the back when he jumped through the window. Where the truth lies, I don't know. However, just like they show in the movie, Billy the Kid would definitely get the blame for that particular killing. And, that kind of lost him a lot of goodwill to a lot of people because Deputy Carlisle was well-liked and well-respected. So a lot of people didn't appreciate the way he was gunned down, whether or not it was the posse or not that did it. Billy still got a lot of the blame for it. And as they show in the movie, Greathouse's roadhouse was burned to the ground the next day. That is something that did occur. I don't know that he got on his horse naked and rode out of town, but like the lady does in the movie, but they definitely did burn his place to the ground.
I guess just from, as you were explaining the two different versions of what could have happened with Carlisle, it sounds like maybe both could be true. Like they could have shot him as he went in the back, shot him as he went out the window. And then also the posse opened fire on him. And who knows? I guess that kind of goes back to what I was talking about. It could be like, starts to get into he said, she said, and the evidence and what really happened. And, we don't know.
Yeah. It's one of those, and come to think of it, you would think that if he was shot in the back as he was coming through the window, somebody would have made note of it, but I'm not aware if there's any contemporary reports that specify where his wounds were. I need to check into that. That's a good idea.
Well, if we head back to the movie's timeline, Pat Garrett and his men finally catch up to Billy and his gang. And this leads to the big climactic shootout where Doc Spurlock is hit badly. He sacrifices himself so everyone else can escape, but it doesn't really work because Billy finds himself surrounded and captured. And then he's sentenced to hang. But before that gets carried out, Jane Greathouse comes back and she sneaks a gun into the outhouse so Billy can use it to make his escape. In the process, he kills some of the bad guy deputies that we've grown to dislike throughout the movie. And he rides off to join the rest of his gang. Once he's there, we find out that Chavez was mortally wounded. And I know there's a lot in there, but all of that happens in the movie. It's just like 10 minutes of screen time. So it really seems like the movie is rushing through a lot of events to kind of wrap up a lot of these different storylines. Is there any truth to those things that we see happening in that fast-paced sequence of events?
A little bit of truth in there. So like you said, it's they gloss over a lot of stuff. So, okay. At this point in time, after the debacle at White Oaks, Billy's on the run. Pat Garrett's hunting him down. And, it wasn't just Pat Garrett that was after him. There was a contingent of cattlemen from the Texas Panhandle who were also on the hunt for Billy. What Billy was doing at this period following the Lincoln County War, basically he was stealing horses in New Mexico, trailing them all the way up to the Texas Panhandle, selling them to ranchers there, and then on his way back to New Mexico, he would steal a bunch of cattle and sell them to people here in New Mexico. So you had Pat Garrett hunting him down. Believe it or not, there was actually a Secret Service agent who was in New Mexico at that time hunting Billy down, thinking that he was connected to a counterfeiting ring. And you had the cowboys from Texas. And even the military was on the hunt for Billy the Kid. So a lot of people were looking for him. His sort of safe place was Fort Sumner. You see Fort Sumner a lot throughout the movie. The part where he's hanging out with the guy he keeps calling Beaver, that was a real life guy named Beaver Smith that had a cantina there at Fort Sumner. But Billy felt safe there. It was a predominantly Hispanic area. He was very friendly with the Hispanics. He got along amazingly with them. He spoke their language fluently. Was very assimilated into their culture, so he felt safe there. Well, as soon as Garrett gets the badge, he ends up linking up with those cowboys from Texas, and they lie in wait at Fort Sumner and set up an ambush. So one day, Billy and the boys are riding up. Billy the Kid just so happens to be riding sort of in the rear of the column. When they get right up to the gates, Garrett yells out for him to halt. Billy's friend, Tom Folliard, goes for his pistol. They blast him out of the saddle, kill him. Billy and the others are able to wheel their horses around and escape. Skip ahead a couple of days later, and they're at what's called the Stone House at a place called Stinking Springs. It wasn't very far away from Fort Sumner at all. And it was just an old, abandoned, just tiny one-room building made of rocks, basically. That's kind of what you see in that scene where they show Scurlock being gunned down. So basically 3 days later, or it may have been 4 days later, Garrett and the posse tracked them down to the Stone House, surrounded in the middle of the night. And the next morning, one of Billy's good friends, a guy named Charlie Bowdry, steps outside. He's wearing a big sombrero of the kind that Billy the Kid also was partial to. He's mistaken for Billy the Kid. Garrett gives the signal, rifle sound, and Bowdry is shot to pieces. Charlie Bowdry was a Lincoln County regulator. He did help Billy steal in livestock after the Lincoln County War. But at this point, he was kind of pulling a Doc Scurlock. He was distancing himself. He had gotten married. He was trying to settle down. That was the last person they wanted to kill, Garrett and them. It was a complete accident. So in Young Guns 2, when you see Doc Scurlock being gunned down, that never happened. Doc was living in Texas at the time. That is actually a pretty accurate portrayal of the death of the very real life Charlie Bowdry. There was a siege. Believe it or not, Garrett actually brought in a wagon. They started cooking breakfast outside to lure the boys out, and it worked. They all surrendered. So it was Billy the Kid, Rudaball, Tom Pickett, and Billy Wilson. All these guys ended up coming out. They surrendered. They were arrested and taken to Las Vegas, New Mexico, and placed in jail. Billy was in jail for a while. He was actually tried and convicted for murder during this period. He's then taken to Lincoln to await his execution. So that all the stuff that you're saying they glossed over, absolutely. We don't get to see him. Well, you do see the trial. We do see that in the movie. I forgot about that. The judge says he's going to hang by the neck until he's dead. And Billy tells him, you can go to hell. But yeah, they did sort of gloss over a few things. It wasn't Scurlock who was killed. It was actually a guy named Charlie Bowdry. Now, if anybody is not familiar with any of these people and you're a little morbidly curious, do a Google image search for Charlie Bowdry, and you'll find the photo of him and his wife that was actually taken off of his body. Still has the bloodstains on it. Really cryptic image, but he was a real deal outlaw, very tough guy, and unfortunately, he was trying to go straight at the time. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, got killed.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I guess that kind of goes back to they don't have I know they have wanted posters, but they don't have, mug shots and photographs and things like that to know what somebody actually looks like. So they're going, it sounds like what you said, they were going off Garrett's recognition of him, right? Garrett gave the shot or gave the order.
That's what it seems to be. It seems to be the case to me as well. I mean, Garrett just, it was a case of mistaken identity,
Well, throughout the movie, I really felt like it could have benefited from some titles, clarifying dates and locations. Perhaps that sequence there is perhaps the most obvious at the end, because the whole time they're talking about going to Old Mexico, and there's one line of dialogue after the shootout where Arkansas Dave asks a couple of guys nearby if he's in Old Mexico, and they simply nod. So he seems to think that he's finally made it. And since the whole gang talked about going to Old Mexico the entire movie, that led me to believe, as I was watching it, that maybe finally they made it to Old Mexico after this big shootout. Can you clarify the actual locations where these events in the movie took place? I'm assuming not near Old Mexico.
Yeah, there is some indication that Billy was planning on going to Mexico, and one of his buddies would write a book. Gosh, man. It was one of the Coe cousins. It was either Frank or George Coe who said that Billy was planning on going to Mexico and laying low. He just had to settle some business there at Fort Sumner. I do think that's pretty plausible. He just dragged his feet too long about doing it, and he got. But Dave Rudaball would flee to Old Mexico like they show in the movie. It wasn't immediate like that. He would live for several more years. But yeah, he would eventually find his way to Mexico, to a place called Parral, Mexico. And he got crossways with the wrong guys. They shot him dead, and they cut his head off and placed it on a pike. So that part was real. I think you see him kind of sharpening their machetes and get ready to take care of him. It just didn't happen as immediate as they show in the movie. Most of the movie is going to take place either in Lincoln, New Mexico, or Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Maybe, the scene where they show Garrett meeting with John Chisholm and being offered the job of sheriff. Maybe that's supposed to represent the capital of Santa Fe, or maybe Roswell. I'm not sure, but I know what you're talking about. It does sort of seem like they're just on the run towards New Mexico the entire time. Or I'm sorry, Old Mexico. But no, most of what you're seeing there is either taking place at Lincoln or Fort Sumner or the surrounding area.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Because I got the impression that they're trying to make it there, but they never really seem to make it there.
Rudaball did, but I'm sure at his final moments he wished he hadn't.
At the very end of the movie, Pat Garrett is alone when he finds Billy the Kid, and he seems to regret being in the position of killing his old friend, according to the movie. Garrett says this hurts him to do it, but he's in a place that he can't get out of. And Billy says he's going to make it easy and then turns his back to Garrett. There's a gunshot, but the movie never really shows Billy getting hit. And then in the next scene, we see a casket being lowered into the ground with Garrett and Chisholm, and they're watching this going on. And then the movie cuts back to the elderly Brushy Bill telling his story to the lawyer from the beginning. So from the movie's perspective, it seems to suggest that Pat Garrett helped Billy the Kid fake his death, and then he lived out the rest of his days as Brushy Bill Roberts. There's even some text at the end of the movie that says Brushy Bill went before the New Mexico governor Thomas Mabry on November 29th, 1950. And despite identification by several surviving friends of the notorious outlaw, Brushy Bill was discredited. Finally, I'm going to quote this last bit of text from the movie. So this is a quote from the movie. It says, quote, "Whether or not Brushy Bill Roberts was Billy the Kid remains a mystery," end quote. Can you help unravel the history that we know from the movie's version of this guy named Brushy Bill Roberts living in the 1950s actually being Billy the Kid?
Yeah, so I'm glad you included that quote, especially the word mystery. There's a lot of mystery, taking Brushy Bill out of the equation for now. There's a lot of mystery surrounding Billy the Kid's life. There's a lot of stuff that we make assumptions about that we don't know for certain. We don't know when he was born. We don't know where he was born. We don't know how old he was when he died. We don't know his father's name, his mother's maiden name. There's so much we don't know about Billy the Kid. His death is probably the least mysterious aspect of his entire life. So, once again, there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding his death. to be frank, there's a lot of false information that people put out there. I'm really not sure why. But one of the things that people seem to think is true that's not true is that Garrett killed Billy the Kid without anybody else seeing what was happening, and then buried his body before anybody could get a good look at it. That could not be farther from the truth. So Garrett had two deputies with him at the time, Kit McKinney and John W. Poe. They snuck into Fort Sumner under the cover of dark. They eventually made their way to the home of Pete Maxwell. So Fort Sumner used to be a legitimate military installation. A guy named Lucian Maxwell bought the fort from the Army, I want to say in the late 1860s. I could be wrong about that date. Lucian Maxwell ended up passing away. Everything went to his widow and his kids. His son was Pete Maxwell. So by the time these events are unfolding, Pete Maxwell basically had the run of Fort Sumner. The lady I mentioned earlier, Paulita Maxwell, that was Pete's sister and also Billy the Kid's alleged girlfriend. So if anybody knew where Billy the Kid was, it was going to be Pete Maxwell, right? Pat and his deputies make their way. Once again, it's the middle of the night. It's dark. They kind of sneak their way inside the fort. They go because they want to talk to Pete Maxwell, basically to ask him, hey, have you seen Billy? Do you know where Billy could be? They were not expecting to find Billy the Kid there. Matter of fact, both, Garrett obviously would write his book, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid. John W. Poe, decades later, he would write his own book called The Death of Billy the Kid. And they're both very clear that they kind of felt like they were on a wild goose chase at this point. They knew Billy was in the area. They just didn't think he would be, for lack of better words, I guess naive enough to actually be inside Fort Sumner itself when he was such a wanted man by this point. And they definitely didn't think he'd be at Pete Maxwell's place, right? So Garrett goes inside to question Pete Maxwell. He leaves his two deputies outside on the porch. This happened very quickly, like in less than a couple of minutes. Right at that moment, Billy the Kid comes strolling up. He doesn't have his boots on. He's in his stockings, as they called them. He's got a pistol in one hand and a butcher knife in the other. He's going to get a midnight snack. There was a slaughtered steer. He was going to cut a piece of meat off of it, take it back to a friend's house. They were going to cook him a midnight snack, and he was going to go to sleep. So he wasn't expecting Garrett either. It was the perfect storm. He's almost on the deputies when he notices them. He immediately raises his pistol and starts asking them in Spanish. Once again, that was a predominantly Spanish area. He's asking them, "¿Quién es? Who is it? ¿Quién es? ¿Quién es?" As he's doing that, he's backing into Pete Maxwell's bedroom. The layout of Fort Sumner was a little strange. There's a lot more involved here. He did not have an interior door going to his room where he stayed. It was an exterior door. So Billy just backed into it. He asked Pete, who are those guys outside? At the same moment, he sees a shadowy figure standing next to Pete Maxwell's bed, lifts his pistol again, says, "¿Quién es?" And that's when Garrett shoots him and kills him. So right off the bat, you've got an eyewitness in Pete Maxwell. The whole entire town converged on that building as soon as this happened. Pete Maxwell did not live alone. His mother, his siblings, other relatives all lived in that house. They came to his room. They saw Billy the Kid lying there dead. Everybody else was looking in the window. They saw Billy the Kid's body lying in there dead. Things were so tense that Garrett and his deputies had to fort up inside of Pete Maxwell's room for the rest of the night. They were expecting the mob to attack him just to avenge Billy's death. The attack never came. The next morning, a coroner's jury was formed. Every single one of the people that were in the coroner's jury were people who personally knew Billy the Kid. They saw the body. They interviewed Pete Maxwell. They talked to the deputies. They talked to Garrett. They issued a coroner's jury report. It was basically the same thing as a death certificate back in those days, describing the entire event and explicitly saying that, yes, Billy the Kid was shot and killed by Pat Garrett. Later on that morning, they released Billy's body to the citizens of Fort Sumner. He was a very popular figure there. A lot of people loved him. Not everybody loved him, but a lot of people did. They dressed and cleaned his body, or they cleaned his body. They dressed it in new clothes. Other people dug the grave. They held a public wake. Like, there was a literal public wake. So many, many, many people saw Billy the Kid's dead body. The funeral was attended by nearly everybody in town, according to Paulita Maxwell. And that was it. And of course, Billy the Kid was never seen again after that happened. So there is a lot of evidence coming from multiple sources that Pat Garrett did indeed kill Billy the Kid. There was no photograph taken. A lot of people are under the false impression that every dead outlaw had their pictures taken back in those days. Once again, nothing could be further from the truth. I know what people are thinking of because there are a lot of, I hate to say it this way, but a lot of cool photos of dead outlaws from the Old West. They would prop them up, take pictures of them, turn them into postcards. That is something that did happen on occasion, but I mean, we only have like maybe 15 to 20 of those type of photos. At the same time, there was probably 1,000 outlaws at any given time roaming the West. There's a lot of people, like Dave Rudaball, for example. We don't have any photos of him while he was alive, right? And he was a much more accomplished outlaw than Billy the Kid ever was. There's a lot of people that we don't have photographic evidence of their death, right? But some people will point to that and say, aha, that's how we know that Pat Garrett did not kill Billy the Kid, because we don't have a photo. Well, number one, he didn't have to provide photographic proof. He had all the proof he needed in the coroner's jury report and all the eyewitnesses. And we know that because he was paid the reward eventually for killing Billy the Kid. And there was no photographer that lived in Fort Sumner. This was a very tiny community. I want to say it was less than 300 people. No photographer, probably within about 2 or 3 days riding of Fort Sumner. Okay, so, and one more thing. Historians have been able to identify at least, I always forget on the exact number, it's over 24 people by name who saw Billy the Kid's dead body. A lot of these people lived for a very, very long time. I'm talking up until the 1920s, 30s. Some of these people wrote books. Some of them had their journals published. Many of them were interviewed by historians and journalists. And, there may be certain details that people get wrong. Just like any crime, if there's a carjacking and a police officer shows up, somebody's going to say it happened at 1:15 in the afternoon. Somebody else is going to say, no, it was after 2:00. Somebody's going to say the guy was wearing a green shirt. Somebody else is going to say, but they all agreed that guy definitely stole that car, right? It was the same thing with Billy's death. Not all the details line up. Maybe not everybody agrees on the timing, but the one thing that they all maintained for literally the rest of their lives, even after Pat Garrett was long gone, was that Garrett absolutely killed Billy the Kid. So there's a ton of evidence showing that it's kind of all the mystery, the supposed mystery surrounding the kid's death is pretty much ado about nothing. By contrast, there is zero evidence that Brushy Bill Roberts was who he claimed he was. It's a cool story, man. I love, when I was a kid, I believed that Brushy Bill Roberts was Billy the Kid. And to this day, if there was a new discovery that definitively proved that Brushy was Billy the Kid, I would be ecstatic. I don't look up to Billy the Kid as a hero like a lot of people. I'm pretty neutral on the people I cover on my show. They were just historical figures, But he is a very sympathetic character. And he was a likable guy when he was alive. He was fun-loving. If me and you got in a time machine right now and were whisked back to Fort Sumner, we would be in no danger. Billy the Kid is not just going to shoot you like a dog in the streets. He wasn't a psychopath. A lot of the people I cover on my show were definitely psychopaths. Billy was a young kid who got caught up with the wrong people. He probably had a little bit of aversion to authority, but he wasn't an evil person. And we don't like the idea of him just being killed in the dark like that at the hands of Pat Garrett, somebody that used to be his friend. It's not a fairy tale ending. We never get to see Billy the Kid grow up to be Billy the Man, essentially, So I think a lot of people just don't want it to be true. They don't want Billy to have been killed the way he was. Somebody like Brushy Bill Roberts comes along. It's a very compelling story at surface level. So people just, they buy it hook, line, and sinker. Now, Brushy, like I said, on the surface, it's very compelling. The story goes that Brushy had all of the same scars as Billy the Kid. that he was fluent in Spanish, just like Billy the Kid. That he was ambidextrous, could shoot just as well with both hands. That he had tiny hands and big wrists, just like Billy the Kid. He knew things about the Lincoln County War that nobody could have possibly known unless they were Billy the Kid or very close to Billy the Kid. And yeah, I think you sort of touched on this earlier. There were people who knew Billy the Kid that vouched for Brushy Bill Roberts. Sounds very compelling. If any of that I just said was true, I would be convinced. But if you dig just a little bit deeper, it all falls apart. So we can start with the multiple gunshot wounds. Brushy Bill, well, have you ever known a pathological liar?
Yeah, unfortunately.
A lot of times they don't know when to stop. So they'll take a tiny lie and it'll snowball until it's just this fantastical, unbelievable fairy tale story. Brushy Bill was the same. He the stories he told were, if you tried to print them as a fiction novel now, you'd be laughed out of the publishing house. Like we're not gonna print this. This is too silly. This would be a comedy story, you know. But so Brushy didn't just say that he was shot a couple of times. He had been shot, I want to say 34 times. He claimed he had 34 various bullet wounds and knife wounds over his body. Did he have the same scars as Billy the Kid? Well, how many times was Billy the Kid shot when he was still, before Pat Garrett killed him? Possibly once. There's some evidence he took a bullet to the thigh when they ambushed and killed Sheriff Brady. Even that's not like proven for a fact, because just a couple of days later, Billy was on his feet participating in a completely different gunfight at Blazer's Mill. So we think he was possibly wounded. It may have been a grazing wound at one point in his life, but he certainly wasn't riddled with scars like Brushy Bill Roberts claimed that he was. So no, he didn't have any of the same scars as Billy the Kid, because we don't know what scars Billy the Kid had. Number two, there is no evidence that Brushy Bill Roberts had any scars. You know, there's a lot of photos of Brushy Bill Roberts out there, but neither he or his lawyer ever thought to document any of these supposed scars. A lot of people are under the false impression that there's an autopsy report out there documenting the scars. There's no autopsy report. He died of a heart attack. You know, when an old man dies of a heart attack, they don't necessarily perform an autopsy. So the only evidence we have of Brushy's scars comes only from his attorney, William Morrison. I don't think I've said it yet, but after Brushy passed away in 1950, a couple of years later, Morrison actually published a book sharing Brushy's story. It's called Alias Billy the Kid. As far as the supposed inside information that Brushy Bill Roberts had that nobody could possibly know, there has been nothing that he said that wasn't already common knowledge. So there was a guy named Walter Noble Burns. In the early 1920s, he kind of made the rounds there in New Mexico, and he interviewed a lot of people that knew Billy the Kid back in the day. He talked to Paulina Maxwell, Billy's old girlfriend. Another dear friend of Billy's was a lady named Delvina Maxwell. He talked to her. He interviewed a lot of people. And he published a book called The Saga of Billy the Kid in 1925 or 26. This book is one of the main pieces of works that kind of catapulted Billy into superstardom. The book was a huge bestseller. Everybody had it. I need to double check on this. I may be wrong here, but I believe it was one of the first book of the month books, or book of the month club books, right? It was such a popular book that it was serialized, and they ran it in newspapers all over the country. Brushy Bill Roberts definitely read The Saga of Billy the Kid, because while it is a very cool book, not everything is historically correct in it. Burns did make quite a few mistakes. Brushy Bill Roberts also happens to make the same exact mistakes, almost word for word, that Burns made. So basically all of his insider knowledge, he was just copying off of other people. And it was information that had been known for decades. The affidavits. Brushy Bill Roberts and his attorney were able to obtain 5 signed and sworn affidavits from people that supposedly knew Billy the Kid and vouched that Brushy and Billy were one and the same. Once again, you just got to dig a little bit deeper. Out of those 5 people, 3 of them never knew the historical Billy the Kid ever. One of them wasn't even born yet in 1881 when Pat Garrett shot Billy the Kid. So if he wasn't even alive at the time, how could he possibly know if Brushy Bill Roberts and Billy the Kid were the same? The best they could do was there were these 2 old men that had lived in Lincoln, New Mexico. They had allegedly known Billy the Kid when they were young children. I'm talking like 12 years old. They weren't Billy the Kid's friends. They weren't his outlaw buddies. They weren't Old West lawmen, nothing like that. These were 2 old men who, 70 years after the fact, they may have possibly known Billy the Kid. And even one of them, when he first met up with Brushy, he goes, "No, you're way too young to be Billy the Kid." For whatever reason, he changed his mind a couple of days later, but that's the best they could do. So whenever Brushy Bill proponents will try to say that people who actually knew Billy the Kid vouched for him, kind of. None of Billy's old associates ever vouched for him. None of his Lincoln County regulators ever vouched for Brushy Bill Roberts. Once again, the best they could find were 2 old guys who possibly knew Billy the Kid when they were very, very young. So every other aspect of Brushy's story falls under this same purview. I mentioned earlier that he kind of went a little bit too far in his exaggerations. In addition to being the most famous outlaw of all time, he also claimed to have been a Pinkerton detective. He said he was a deputy U.S. Marshal under Hanging Judge Parker. He lived with 3 different Native American tribes at 3 different times. He fought in Cuba as a Rough Rider with Teddy Roosevelt. He fought as a mercenary in Mexico with Pancho Villa. On another occasion, he survived a running gunfight with 2,000 Mexican soldiers. He chased after horse thieves in Oklahoma. He was a gunfighter in Idaho. He was a professional boxer. He was a rodeo champ, toured all over the place. He worked for Buffalo Bill Cody on his ranch breaking horses. He's claimed to have had his own Wild West show that toured extensively across the United States, putting on, those reenactments of Old West events. He caught wild horses in South America. I could go on and on with he was a lookout for the famous Lady Bandit Bellstar. There's a million stories that Brushy Bill Roberts told, and I cannot stress this enough. There's no evidence for any of it. By contrast, the evidence we do have, which is legion, shows that Brushy Bill Roberts was a toddler when the real Billy the Kid was shot and killed. So Brushy's real name was Oliver Roberts. You can find him on every single census from 1880 all the way to his death in 1950. Every single census. We have marriage certificates. We have divorce decrees. There's a family Bible that shows that he was born in 1879. There's even a World War I draft registration. We know what Brushy Bill Roberts did, where he lived, what his occupation was, the names of his wives, the name of his parents. We know dang near every detail of his life. And at no point was he an outlaw. At no point did he live in New Mexico. Like I said, he was 1.5, 2 years old when the real Billy the Kid was gunned down. Now, you may be wondering, why do people believe in Brushy Bill's story if there's that much evidence? The one tiny thread, the one tiny little string that holds his entire story together. He never gave a date on this, but he claimed that later in life, he was in Oklahoma, and he came across a couple of lawmen who had just killed what they thought was a horse thief. Well, it wasn't a horse thief. It was an undercover police officer who just so happened to be Brushy Bill Roberts' cousin, Oliver Roberts. Okay, his much younger cousin. Brushy took his belongings back to Texas to his family. Oliver's mother mistook him for Oliver, and he just went with it. At that point on, he kind of slid into that new identity of Oliver Roberts, which is why Brushy Bill proponents will say, well, that's why he's so much younger on all the census data and all the records, because he wasn't really Oliver Roberts. He just kind of slid into his identity after he died. Once again, there's no evidence of any of this occurring. I don't know about you, but if my brother died and my cousin returned his belongings, I wouldn't let my grieving mother think that was her dead son. You know what I'm saying? Like, There's just so many fantastical angles to his story. And when you add them all up, they're just completely unbelievable. You can even just Google pictures of Brushy Bill Roberts. There's a lot of pictures of him out there. In none of those pictures does he look anywhere near 90 years of age. In all reality, he was 70, 71 when he dropped dead of that heart attack. But yeah, there's no evidence that he was Billy the Kid. Some people will try to tell you that there was a DNA test proving that they were the same person. No, Billy has never been exhumed. There has never been a DNA test done on Billy the Kid. Never happened. So I can tell you with, there's a lot of mysteries in the Old West. I can tell you with 110% certainty that Brushy Bill Roberts was definitely a fraud. And he hung out with other frauds. There's another guy that was also an Old West fraudster named J. Frank Dalton. He claimed to be Jesse James. And he and Brushy were best friends. They would hang out together. They would go to Brushy Bill Roberts, I think, attended J. Frank Dalton's 100th birthday. So they were thick as thieves, and they were just telling lies, man.
So in the movie, it suggests that the reason why Brushy Bill is coming forward is because he wants that pardon that we see happening to Billy the Kid. And that seems to be the impression that I got, was that's why he came forward near the end of his life. He's like, I finally want this pardon that I've been promised. Was that really what he was going for? Or was the real Brushy Bill just, as you said, just telling lies and couldn't stop? Or was he trying to sell his own book, or was he trying to make money off of it? Like, what was his motivation, I guess would be my question.
I an acronym that I like, it's MICE, MICE. So it's a good way to kind of figure out someone's motive: money, ideology, coercion, and ego. I don't think Brushy Bill was doing this on ideological grounds. I don't think somebody was coercing him or blackmailing him into telling these lies. I think it was a mixture of money and ego. Now Brushy had a very long history of telling tall tales. Even before he was claiming to be Billy the Kid, he used to tell people he was like a scout, an old army scout and a frontiersman. There's even an old newspaper article, gosh, man, I want to say from the 1920s. So we're talking decades before he claimed to be Billy the Kid. In this newspaper article, he's making this wild claim that he saved a group of Texas Rangers from machine gun wielding gangsters. So he had a history of telling these type of stories. I do know that Brushy was living in poverty in his later years. So I think money certainly played a role in it. Like I said, he was good friends with J. Frank Dalton. J. Frank Dalton was kind of being wined and dined by people. He was living rent free. He was taking trips to New York City. I think maybe Brushy wanted a little bit of that limelight. And he really did meet with the governor. That is something that occurred. He basically got laughed out of there. I mean, he forgot key details. He couldn't answer very simple questions. And it was just a big joke. And about a month later is when he just fell dead of a massive heart attack. But, people will ask me, well, why would he possibly lie about that? I don't know, man. I don't know why anybody would lie about that, but I have known people that told similar lies. I've known old men who told similar lies. There was a movie a few years ago, The Irishman, with Robert De Niro, the Scorsese movie. And that was based on a book called We Paint Houses, I believe. This guy, he claimed to have killed Jimmy Hoffa and claimed to have done all this stuff. A lot of the stuff that guy claimed to have done, we know that he absolutely did not do. But yet, he was a dying old man, and he still told these stories that were lies. Why? I don't know, but I do know it's human nature. It is something that does happen.
Well, like you said, there are compulsive liars out there too. That once you get started on that, I imagine the money part aside, the ego, like just feeling people asking you these questions and people focusing on you. Today, it's a dopamine hit, right? We know that, but that's one of those things. I would imagine that he might not have known even why he did it himself. Just that I like being Billy the Kid, right? I like when people think I'm Billy the Kid. So keep telling those stories to keep more people thinking that. Yeah, that's the only thing I can think of.
It's the same way nowadays. People will lie about stolen valor. People that weren't ever in the military will claim to be Navy SEALs and stuff like that. It happens all the time. Why? And especially in Brushy's day, there wasn't the internet, so we couldn't just immediately fact check the guy, right? All of those records weren't, you couldn't get on ancestry.com in 1950 and look at all of his census records. So he probably was able to convince quite a few people.
Especially for something like you mentioned, with the wounds, like we don't really know what Billy the Kid's wounds were. So how would you know? Maybe he has the same wounds, but we don't know what Billy the Kid had. So how would you know?
And, I was talking to one of my buddies about this the other day. My father recently turned 80 years old. He was in the Vietnam War. He was in a combat intensive unit during the Vietnam War, but he was never wounded. Thankfully, my dad came home and spent the rest of his life raising a family. But he lived kind of a rough life. My dad grew up on a cotton farm, no electricity. I mean, he grew up pretty rough. If my dad wanted to start telling stories and say that he has all these war wounds, people would probably believe him because he looks like he has war wounds. He's missing a couple of fingers. He was in a hunting accident when he was younger and got shot in the face with a shotgun. He could easily lie and say he got all of these wounds in the Vietnam War, which he was in the war, but these are just injuries that he's accumulated throughout the course of his life. I think Brushy Bill Roberts was much the same because Brushy Bill, he spent the vast majority of his life as a laborer. He did a lot of blue collar work, farming. I think he was working on oil rigs later on in life. Like this guy would have he would have looked rough. He would have certainly have had scars and marks of his own that were most likely work related injuries that he could have, hey, look at this. This is where I got shot back in 1885 when really, he got kicked by a mule when he was 12, So I don't doubt that he did have markings that may have appeared to be scars to the uninitiated, but as far as him ever getting any type of gunfights and stuff like that, absolutely not.
Well, you mentioned the name Jesse James, and a lot of people are familiar with Jesse James, Billy the Kid, because there's so many movies that have been made about them. But let's say you're given the budget to make a movie about someone from the Old West that hasn't had a movie made about them yet. Who would you pick and why?
This is so hard to choose because there's so many great stories that have gone completely untold. What's fresh on my mind right now, because I'm currently doing a series on it right now, but Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce War. Wow. I mean, you hear a lot of stories about people having the indigenous peoples having their land stolen and being screwed over and stuff like that. I'm not sure if there's as much of a clear, just open and shut case of them being screwed over as much as the Nez Perce were in the events that led to the Nez Perce War. I mean, these were a very peaceful people. They weren't raiding the American settlers or anything like that. It just basically came down to, hey, we want your land, so you have to leave now. And by the way, we're going to kill some of your people until you leave. And they eventually pushed them to the limit and a war broke out. But it's a very fascinating story. And just the way the Nez Perce, it was basically a 1,400-mile running gunfight with the U.S. Army. There was maybe 250 Nez Perce warriors with hundreds of women and children, old and sick, against thousands of U.S. troops, and they still held them off time and time again. Were able to defeat them in battle time and time again. It truly is an amazing story, and it's a heartbreaking story because it doesn't end well for the Nez Perce people. But I would love to see something like that. Not necessarily a movie. I would love to see that made into like an HBO miniseries or something, something that they could really, put about 8 or 9 hours into telling the story.
Yeah, dive a lot deeper into the story for that. Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about the true story behind Young Guns 2. For anyone who wants to learn more about the history of the Old West, I highly recommend they check out your podcast called the Wild West Extravaganza. You obviously do a ton of research and do a great job bringing the stories of the Old West to life. So Can you give my audience a peek into your podcast and where they can find it?
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel, the Wild West Extravaganza. It's also available wherever else you listen to podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or you can go to my website, wildwestextra.com. But yeah, I'm everywhere where you listen to podcasts.
Fantastic. I'll add all those links in the show notes for this episode too. Thanks again so much for your time, Josh.
Thank you, man. My pleasure.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. Thank you once again to Josh from the Wild West Extravaganza podcast for helping us separate fact from fiction in Young Guns 2. Now, if you want to dig deeper into the true story of Billy the Kid and even more tales from the American Old West, check out Josh's fantastic podcast called Wild West Extravaganza over at wildwestextra.com. As always, you'll find links to that in the show notes for this episode, as well as on the show's home on the web over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/374. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our two truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the two truths and one lie again. Number 1, Billy the Kid's safe place was Fort Sumner. Number 2, Pat Garrett never rode with Billy the Kid's outlaw gang. Number 3, Garrett and Billy robbed a train together in 1879. Did you figure out which one is a lie? Got the answer right here, so let's open up the envelope. And the lie is number 3. Josh told us that Pat Garrett never rode with Billy the Kid as an outlaw. And on top of that, Billy never robbed any trains either. He was a cattle and horse thief, but no trains or stagecoaches or anything like that. Thanks for sticking around to the end. Perhaps you've heard from previous episodes, but as a reminder, I took the time to share some practical steps to help podcasters add video to their show. So if you're also a podcaster or know someone who is, check out my class to see if it'll help you out. I'll share the behind the scenes of my own video setup, as well as how you can get the most out of whatever camera or microphone that you have. Or if you're in the market for a new one, there are some recommendations in there as well. Learn more about that over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/video. Once again, that's basedonatruestorypodcast.com/video. Until next time, thanks so much for spending your time with Josh and I today, and I'll chat with you again really soon.